46 years ago today, Portugal became a democracy. It was called the Carnation Revolution, which is proof that socialism leads to freedom. I'm Bernie Bro, and let me explain away. On this day, April 25th, 1974, Portugal went from being an authoritarian dictatorship within not even a full day later, the early mornings, turned into a democracy. Let me explain. In 1932, the government of Portugal became fascist. It wasn't the kind of fascism that was to the level of Hitler's Nazi Germany. It was probably closer to Benito Mussolini's, and maybe not as authoritarian, but still was an authoritarian dictatorship. The country was led by Antonio Salazar. He, with an iron fist, persecuted the left. It was a nation that became a clerical fascist state. It was an imperialist nation. Of course, Portugal was a colonial power for centuries, just like all the other major European powers. But they were really the last kind of relevant European superpower. They still had colonies in Africa, a little bit in South America, in Asia. And in those colonies, they were, especially in Africa, they were fighting for their freedoms, for their independence. Places like Angola, for example. Unlike Hitler, and I'm not going to say that Antonio Salazar was racially liberal, but it wasn't a racism to that level. But it was still a fascism. Um, and he declared all his colonies around the world to be all part of the Portuguese Empire and part of a greater Portugal. The name, the name of, or the he described Portugal as the Estado Novo, which in English translates into the new state. Portugal was neutral during World War II, just like Spain under Francisco Franco. It was a member of NATO after World War II, and in the name of fighting communism and Cold War mentality, a lot of countries, a lot of Western allies kind of looked the other way, as there was a lot of human rights abuse, as it intensified in Portugal. And in keeping up empires, and Lord knows what the United States have done in the Middle East the past 20 years, occupying Iraq and Afghanistan with the invasion and all that, what has done to us as a nation, where we're on a point of economic collapse with the mounting debt. Well, Portugal, same thing in many ways. They were going through an internal decline, and there's been many movements that try to put a stop to the Estado Novo, and it failed. By the early 70s, like 1970, Antonio Salazar had a stroke, died. His successor was Martin Caetano, and I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. I'm sorry. But Martin Citano um, was a harsh authoritarian, but probably not to the level of Antonio Salazar. By the year 1974, to make a long story short, a squadron of army captains got together and formed what was called the Armed Forces Movement. These were leftists that saw what happened and the atrocities in Angola, Guinea, and other colonies around the world, and they were bothered by what happened. They were radicalized. They were radicalized by the liberation struggles that was going on, by the indigenous populations that were fighting for their independence. And these people had a conscience. And so they were radicalized themselves. And they wanted to see dictatorship end in Portugal. They wanted to see the colonies liberated and granted their independence. They founded what was called, as I said, the Armed Forces Movement. And they decided, we're going to do a coup. It's now or never. And the plan was to do everything you can do to avoid as much bloodshed as possible. They were anticipating a worst case scenario, but they wanted the movement to be as peaceful as it can be. The irony is, it was one of the most peaceful revolutions ever. They didn't anticipate it, but I'm sure they were more than happy that's the way it turned out. So, just after midnight on April 20, the early morning of April 25th, late April 24th, these squadron of army captains around the nation went into Lisbon. They occupied the airports, radio stations, TV stations, police stations, governmental institutions, places where communications, the rail systems, all around Lisbon. And they wanted to negotiate with the government to end their dictatorship. The faction of the government, the military that was loyal to the government, faced the armed forces movement. And they were ordered by the military loyal to the government to fire at the rebels. Because the rebels were perceivably ill equipped and kind of dysfunctional in their eyes. They figured it was going to be an easy sell. Something happened that when they were ordered to fire, the faction of the military loyal to the government refused to obey the order. They stepped off their military vehicles, their tanks, and they walked toward the armed forces movement and joined up. After a few hours and an eventual negotiation between the armed forces movement and Martin Centeno, the president of Portugal, the armed forces movement put themselves under the leadership of General Spinzola, I believe his name. And for the following 2 years, they had what was called the ongoing revolutionary process, which meant that Portugal was transitioning from dictatorship to democracy with elections. As a result of the Carnation Revolution, freedom of speech was legal. Women were granted equality. The Roman Catholic Church was no longer the arbiters of moral policing of a society. Portugal became a full-fledged Western democracy. So whenever you hear the right wing in this country talk about how socialism is antithetical to freedom, ask the people of Portugal that live in a democracy today, those who are old enough to see a fascist government collapse, gently collapse into a democracy. Now, yes, it was one of the most peaceful revolutions in history of a coup. It was a nonviolent coup and it happened so quick, within hours. But yeah, 4 people died. The intelligence agency fired from their buildings out into the crowd. 4 people died. I'm not sure exactly what happened to them once the government collapsed, but when the government officials were rounded up by the armed forces movement, no, they didn't imprison and execute. What they did is they told them to leave the country. They were exiled to Brazil. Portugal the people of Portugal were so grateful. And why it's called the Carnation Revolution is because when people realized in the cities of Lisbon, the city of Lisbon, when they realized that this was a new Portugal, the streets flooded with bouquets of red carnations. Soldiers had carnations on their rifle barrels and on their uniforms and on their cannons of their tanks. I mean, it was just the place was literally flooded with red carnations. And red carnation is a symbol of peace. This was a democratic and peaceful revolution. And I think it's a beautiful revolution. It inspired the people in Eastern Europe in 1989, what they did, standing up against decades of authoritarians. Look what happened. The Berlin Wall came down. The government of Czechoslovakia collapsed. Hungary collapsed. Poland collapsed. The only place in Eastern Europe in '89 that ended violently was in Romania. But freedom came to these people, and freedom came to the people of Portugal. And that's what I want you to know, that it was a democratic and peaceful revolution that transpired. I want you to think about this and remember happy 46th birthday, or anniversary rather, to the Carnation Revolution and the people of Portugal and the democracy that it is today. I want you to subscribe to this channel, and I want you to feel free to comment, good, bad, or indifferent. And remember, folks, I'm Bernie Bro. Peace.